Our first speaker today is going to be Brian Garcia. He's the program director for the Yale Center of Business and Environment. He's recently co-founded a company called Earth Markets that uses environmental markets and community-based strategies to accelerate clean and efficient energy technologies into the marketplace. So, Brian, let me turn it over to you. And I do want to say one more thing. This panel is about policy and standards, and I think you're going to see how important things like building codes, appliance standards are to really getting energy efficiency done in this country and in the world. And there's a tremendous amount of interest right now throughout the world to really enhance and expand things like building codes, get more and better appliance standards. So we have a lot. I think it's going to be interesting. I'm going to time you guys on my phone here, and I'm going to try to keep you all at about 10 minutes so we can get back on track for Leslie, or she may not allow us to have a break. So that's the important part. So you're on first, Brian.
Great, thank you, Brian. So I am going to look at this issue of renewable portfolio standards from the perspective of a speaker series, actually a webinar series that our center has been putting on this year. We've got Daniela Borto and several of her colleagues who have been helping us lead a speaker series this year called Megawatts on Main Street, whose focus is specifically around residential energy efficiency and clean energy. So I'm going to approach the renewable portfolio standard discussion with the idea that these policies can help encourage energy efficiency and renewable energy development for the residential sector. So that's the vantage point that we'll come at it from. Just in terms of the speaker series that we've had so far, these are all the groups and organizations that we've had talk in the webinar. These are publicly accessible. They're free online webinars. They typically happen on Tuesdays or Thursdays at lunchtime, so for those Eastern Standard Time, for those of you who are interested in tuning in. We've had a variety of conversations around these four issues. Our general philosophy here with the residential sector is that no single solution is going to solve, no single approach is going to solve the problem of energy efficiency, whether that's coming up with creative financing mechanisms or public policies. You also need the consumer marketing and advancing technology. So we approach this speaker series with these four things in mind, and I'm specifically just going to talk about policy and finance as it applies to RPS standards. So we've all seen this slide many times. This comes from Lori Bird in the speaker series. This is just real quickly an overview of all the different portfolio standards happening across the country. This speaks to one important thing in the U.S., which is that the policy innovation around clean energy and energy efficiency has been happening at the state level for a long time. So as we start to enter the discussion of what will the federal government do, we start raising issues around hopefully they're establishing floors rather than ceilings for states, but allowing states to continue to innovate around policies. Specifically, I'm going to focus on one state in particular. I've been doing some work recently in the state of Arizona. So we're going to look at their 15% by 2025 renewable portfolio standard target. So in terms of this target, they do have a distributed generation carve-out for their portfolio standard. That's 4.5% of sales by 2025. And it's important now that I think we're learning about RPS standards and having a distributed generation aspect to it, specifically in states like Connecticut, where over 96% of RPS compliance comes from other states, not in Connecticut. So we're not encouraging local development, but in fact encouraging economic development in other states. So you're starting to see this emergence of distributed generation aspects within portfolio standards, and Arizona has one. Half of that distributed generation standard is required to come from the residential sector. So here's another sector that we're talking about that's been left out of the market. Historically, when you look at RPS standards, you've got your United Technologies, your Walmarts, all your big commercial and industrial companies that are able to take advantage of these markets. They've got legal staffs, people who understand how to take a project and monetize renewable energy credits in the market. Well, households don't have that capability. So it's great to see that there's a recognition that households who are paying typically 50% of the cost of these policies are now going to be receiving benefit back from these policies. So Arizona has a 2.5% of sales target by 2025. They also have a different renewable energy credit than we're used to. We're all typically used to a megawatt hour produces one renewable energy credit. They are, one REC is 1 kilowatt hour, and that kilowatt hour also translates into 3,415 BTUs. So they're bringing the thermal side into this equation, which is great. Solar thermal applies to their RPS standard. So just another metric to think about. In terms of what they offer residential homeowners in the solar PV space specifically, they're going from a $3,000 per kilowatt incentive. They're lowering that down to just a little over $2,000. And what that actually does is that actually allows the state of Arizona to access more federal funding, because the lower state incentive you have, the higher cost the higher cost the consumers are paying, the more they're able to pull back from the federal investment tax credit. So you have a policy here that's helping to actually help the state of Arizona shift the burden to the federal government a little bit more here. And just in terms of the economics for the household, you're looking at a payback that drops from 9 years, or that increases from 9 years to 12 years. So as Arizona changes their policies here, we're actually seeing an extension of the payback period to the residential consumer. So from a net present value perspective, we could actually see that the homeowner loses about $3,500 of value because of this change in the policy. And lastly, I think this is an interesting piece to this policy, is that actually, in terms of the upfront incentive that households can receive, they can actually receive an incentive of 120% of the actual load that residential household uses. So you're actually creating power plants now from residential homeowners from this Arizona RPS. So I think from there I'm going to now jump to energy efficiency portfolio standards. This is also another slide from Lori Bird. And we're going to talk specifically about Connecticut. The National Renewable Energy Lab talks a lot about the state of Connecticut being somewhat of a model, or at least an early adopter of this portfolio standard. Great. So Connecticut's target, and just real quickly, let me step back. One renewable energy credit in Connecticut's energy efficiency market is essentially equivalent to 1,000 kilowatt hours of verified electricity reduction. So Connecticut's policy is 4% by 2010. That comes to approximately 1,200 gigawatt hours in terms of the market, rough rule of thumb. By statute, the law says that the ceiling price on these renewable energy credits will be $55. The regulator changed that price, lowered it to $31 based upon utility-run incentive programs and where their average price fares based upon the programs that they support. There's also a floor price of $10 established by statute. But the regulator recently made a decision that, you know, because you could have a lot of people in the market essentially providing, say, 1,500 gigawatt hours of energy efficiency, and they would all receive a $10 floor price. But we had the Consumer Council argue that ratepayers are going to pay this increased burden for efficiency, so they actually threw out this floor price in the market by the regulator, which has caused a lot of problems in Connecticut. From my view on the Connecticut market, I think the policy was very innovative in its upfront design. In terms of its execution, it's been a 100% failure in terms of attracting private sector investment. In terms of measurement and verification that the regulator supports to participate in this market, they definitely support deemed savings. Deemed savings are an approach that utility-run programs have used for years, which is to study how well different interventions have led to reductions from households. They develop algorithms. They then say, if we've installed X number of CFLs in a state, then we expect to receive this amount of kilowatt hours per year for this number of years. So it's just an equation or an algorithm. We actually proposed, and some others, a large-scale data analysis, which is actually looking at bill data. The regulators don't like this. It actually, for them, it was too complicated to think about. So for us, that caused a lot of problems around measurement and verification, because we believe LSDA is a higher order of verification. To my point, the market is broken. We would say because 100% of the renewable energy credits that were sold in this market in 2007 came from the utility-run incentive funds. So in no way has this market actually encouraged private sector development to support renewable energy. So you effectively have a double dipping. This fund receives $100 million a year from ratepayers to invest in commercial, residential, and industrial projects. They take those savings, put those into this market, and get more money effectively to reuse and recycle back in the economy. And last thing is, we had a residential aggregation allowed in Connecticut. This was a decision by the regulator. Would I have like 1 or 2 more minutes? 2 more minutes? Great. So the regulator now allows for residential aggregation in this market. It took a lot to get there. We fought with the utilities to get that. That happened, and then suddenly what happened is you saw 10 private sector companies come into the state of Connecticut to want to provide efficiency. And this was the business model that a lot of us were pushing, which is a lighting CFL model, which is no different than what you're seeing in the clean development mechanism markets and the carbon markets. We want to go into homes, we want to take out inefficient incandescents and install CFLs. From that, we have an independent measurement and verification expert come in and say, here's our estimated savings from that project. We then generate renewable energy credits over the life of that bulb. In some cases, it's 6 to 8 years. Those renewable energy credits hopefully pay for the upfront investment and give a return back to the investor. This was the model a lot of parties came in with. This is what we had conceived coming into this market. What the regulator ended up doing was really discounting the useful life of the measure because of the federal phase-out of incandescent light bulbs. So the regulator came in and said, since CFLs start phasing out in 2012 to 2014, we're not going to give you the full measure life. We're only going to give you 2 to 4 years of that measure life, which destroys the project finance model. So therefore, you're left with the utility program. Problems, the current price for energy efficiency in Connecticut, this is a graph of from 2000 to 2008 of the cost of energy efficiency from the utility-run programs. So we see that to deliver a kilowatt hour of savings today costs about 25 cents. So if they're investing $100 million a year to get a kilowatt hour savings today, that comes to about 25 cents. Now, in comparison to what the private sector might be able to deliver in a portfolio standard market, if you take a 10-year useful life of a measure, you assume a REC price. In this case, on the left hand, we assume a Class 3 RPS alternative compliance payment price, which is $31 at 10 years. We net present value that price and we compare it against the utilities. So we're pretty equal. So we're talking about this left bar chart here, about 25 cents for that kilowatt hour savings compared to what the utility run system benefit funds are doing. Well, the market is more competitive than that, so we're not going to see a $31 ceiling price. We're actually going to see something less. So when we run that number at $20 or $10, we can actually see that the private sector can deliver kilowatt hours more efficiently in this market than the utility run system benefit fund programs. So that was the mark. So a lot of this is to say that as the nation thinks about having energy efficiency portfolio standards as a national strategy, there needs to be ways for us to cap utility participation in this market. They dominate this market given the various incentives that they provide. So what we actually proposed in Connecticut, which was supported by Kimberly-Clark and other industrials, is a cap, 25%. That's all the utilities can do. Anything above that, private sector should deliver. So those are some cons of Connecticut. Real quickly, pros on the RPS, we're seeing the emergence of distributed generation requirements. This is good for local development and jobs. On the con side, we're seeing the exportation of jobs. So Connecticut's renewable energy market is clearly evidence of that. You're seeing a lot of legislators now talk about stopping sending our RPS dollars to Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont, and that will be a constant conversation. Energy efficiency portfolio standards, the pros there, you get really strong performance-based efficiency in this market through independent measurement and verification, and you can also significantly reduce RPS costs when you combine efficiency with renewables. And then the con is what I've talked about just in terms of putting a cap on utility participation. You have to really limit their participation in the market to encourage private sector investment. I think that's it.
Thank you, Brian. It's great. Okay, our next speaker is going to be Bill Fay. Bill is the Executive Director of the Building Energy Efficient Codes Network and the Energy Efficient Codes Coalition, two very important organizations that the Alliance works on very closely with Bill. And Bill, I'm going to let you tell everybody about it.
Good. Good. Is this microphone working? It's the only one without a light on. Can you tell? Okay, good. That's fine. All right. Great. Well, I have the great distinction today to talk about probably in 10 minutes something that is both incredibly arcane and also underappreciated. That's the code system in the United States. The compendium that we're publishing is going to note, and I quote, "For countries and states interested in improving the energy performance of buildings, auditing and adopting an up-to-date energy code is an important first step. And I think that it's important for one very simple reason. If a new building is going to last 70 to 100 years, which means that either that building's efficiency or inefficiency is going to be with us through 2080 or 2110, if you can imagine that. So you now start to understand where it is. And we also have, and I'm going to discuss each facet of code development and adoption and implementation and other things. But as you go through each of these, what you realize is that we really are, in many areas, far behind. We have some innovators, and I want to discuss some of those today. But as I go through some of the facets of building codes, I want to touch on some of the lessons that have been learned by those who are the innovators, and then I want to focus more thoroughly on the local leadership aspect of the presentation. I think, again, quoting the compendium, there must be real political support from local government. Local officials do need to be involved, and a truly dedicated staff championing the effort. Now, there's no place that I can imagine that has a better champion than John Hogan in Seattle, because John's been with the program for 30 years, which is about as long as Seattle's had its energy code. And when you talk to John, you know, he really does touch on each of these elements that I'm about ready to discuss. And it's wonderful to have him involved in code development hearings all the way through to the implementation. You know, when you take a look at what Seattle's learned over the years, you know, the first thing that John will tell you is that they brought everyone together, and I think that that's the key step, at least in order to ensure that you have some sense of adoption or of support for the codes that are adopted, and John has done that very well in Seattle. They also did an extensive training program, not only for the code inspectors and for those that are implementing the program, but also for the community, and reaching out to the building sector as well to try to train them each time that the codes are updated to ensure that practice is there, and they have a very assiduous attention to that effort. And then lastly, they learned that that one of the most critical elements of ensuring that code is properly implemented is to start out right and have the right kind of plan review, and then end up with the right kind of inspection of that kind of process. So those are just things that they've noted that they've learned over the years that they'd impart to others. Dakota County, Minnesota is another one of the case studies that's in the compendium, and what you're going to find in there is that they learned really two things. First of all, they are sharing their ideas very much with other local governments, kind of become somewhat of a mentor to other counties and other programs around there. But secondly, they also understood right off the bat that there was a lot of resistance to codes. And so they armed everyone that worked within in the Dakota County program with the arguments on costs, with the business argument for energy efficiency. And believe me, that really is critical when it comes to acceptance of those codes that are out there. Now, Austin has taken this a little farther. I think it's great to know that Austin had a mayor that was an engineer, and Will Wynn did a phenomenal job, not only bringing in a very strong program involving the utility, Austin Energy, but also most recently establishing a requirement that energy audits had to be completed before a home was sold as a condition of the home sales. And so to kind of reference or maybe change the direction of where Tip O'Neill might advise, virtually all code politics is indeed local. When I take a look at that local activity, and you look at the 5 critical elements of codes, the first one is model code development. When you understand right off the bat that it's the model code that shapes state and local codes, and then in addition to that, and this is kind of a stunning thing, it is adopted by the local officials. Now, that may seem like something many of you know very implicitly, but at the U.S. Conference of Mayors meeting in Washington, D.C., where Will Wynn was the chair of the Energy Committee, he looked out over his fellow mayors and said, how many of you knew that the model code was adopted every 3 years or renewed every 3 years? Not a mayor raised his or her hand. And the second question was, how many of you knew that it's your employees, the code officials, that actually cast the votes that adopt that model code? And again, no one raised their hand, and that was an astonishing thing. And it really it really started the U.S. Conference of Mayors getting very involved in the code development process for the first time that they'd really been engaged. My group put together the 30% solution, which was the first time that the model code process had ever encountered a comprehensive proposal that boosted energy efficiency by 30%. And you know what? We also worked very much with those mayors and others to ensure that those votes were there, that the code officials came, that those local leaders were there. And this is actually something that I think I would encourage on virtually every state. Virginia and Colorado are, again, very, very thorough in making sure that they send strong delegations. It's kind of an unusual thing, but every city is allowed 4, 8, or 12 people to come and vote on the model code. There are tens of thousands of potential eligible votes, and the last code was adopted by 158 votes. You know, so this is, I mean, we aren't getting that kind of local, I mean, we sometimes do with Virginia and Colorado. And I also will point out that for the first time, because of the effort that the mayors did, the effort that EECC did, we had 64% of the code officials in attendance voting in favor of energy efficiency. Now, we needed 2/3 to adopt the 30% solution, so we fell a little short. But we did adopt a model code that was 15% beyond any code that the previous code, and that was the first time we'd seen a sizable increase in energy efficiency of the model code for some time. Now, that's critical because that's what lays the groundwork for additional efforts, and Congress has told states that in accepting ERA money that they also have to begin working on the adoption of that code. So the model code process is something that doesn't usually find its way into discussions about building codes, but the involvement of the local official is absolutely critical. And we got another one coming up in October in Charlotte, North Carolina. And based on the recommendations made so far by the Development Committee, code officials from all around the country will have the opportunity to adopt a code that is going to boost residential energy by nearly 40% and commercial energy by 30%, and eliminate the one competing weaker code that's in the ICC I-code process, the IRC energy chapter. So just understanding the importance of that model code and understanding that there's a local role in the development of it, I think, is absolutely critical. The second, the next element, and probably almost more important, is the local and state code adoption. Here, I think finding ways for states and localities to work with groups like BCAP, the Building Code Assistance Project, or REEEP, the Responsible Energy Code Alliance, is absolutely critical because we are battling war in the states in terms of adoption. Right now, Ohio is working on weakening its code. There's a bill in front of the Georgia legislature that would eliminate the body that is responsible for setting the model code or setting the code in the state of Georgia. At the same time, we have great leadership going on by cities. The city of Rockville, Maryland, city of the District of Columbia, in both instances said, we're not comfortable with just the model code. We're going to focus on a 30% beyond code. So the next two elements are compliance, appraisals, and in both of those instances, again, Congress is starting to get involved with different mandates, working with the Green Builder programs and Green Builder College and utility programs. One of the things that's most critical, we're now talking to Congress about the idea of improving appraisals, and I think that really is what gets at one of the major impediments to support from the building community. And we're starting to find that the builders, I've actually had the president of one of the largest home builders in the country say, I will build a home that's 70% beyond code if I can have those improvements reflected in the appraisal, and so I can make the money out there back on this. And so we are working very closely with builder groups, not only the small guys but also the big guys, to try to work on ways to improve the appraisal process. I notice I'm running out of time, but we have a number of different opportunities here, and the leadership we're seeing at the local level has been absolutely critical at all elements of this. And lastly, it's been critical, most importantly, with the code adoption and then the ultimate implementation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Bill. Our next speaker is going to be Blair Hamilton. Blair is the Policy Director from the Vermont Energy Investment Corporation, VEIC. Like me, Blair's had about 30 years in a broad scope of energy efficiency, and he's best known in the United States for his leadership in forming what we like to call the first energy efficiency utility in the country. So, Blair?
I was asked, the title says talk about system benefit charges. I'm going to try to be true to that charge, but I may stretch the envelope just a little bit in my 8 minutes here. I'll really back up for a minute, because we're here because of climate. And I guess I need to say energy efficiency is increasingly recognized as a central part of any strategy to achieve climate goals. It's low risk, it's proven, it's reliable, but I think increasingly it's also recognized it's the least cost option. And that with all of the focus on, well, what's it going to cost to achieve climate goals, the more efficiency we do, the lower the cost. And so with all due respect, I spent the first half of my life working in renewable energy, but in terms of what do we need to do, a whole lot of to reach climate goals and have it be something that we can get support behind in terms of the cost, it is a lot of efficiency. Essentially, the piece I'm going to talk about is that part of efficiency, resources, and reduced use. I'm separating those because they're really two different elements. One's being more efficient in the way we do things, but also reduced use, like buying a smaller home or a smaller appliance, not just getting a more efficient one. But really, what we're trying to do is close that gap. As sustainable energy resources ramp up, we need to bring down the curve until those meet, and the sooner the better. How much? Well, I'm going to just go out there and make a suggestion. I think increasingly what we see from people who are trying to do the maps about how do we reach climate goals, whether it's scientists or researchers or national governments, increasingly the kind of numbers I'm seeing are people saying we're going to have to get at least half of our carbon reductions from efficiency. And I would suggest, from work I was doing in Europe in the last few months, a lot of people are talking about scenarios that look to about 60% from efficiency, 20% from on-site zero carbon generation, either biomass or solar, and then the other 20% coming from decarbonized grid supply. Depending on where you are, in Europe that means massive offshore wind in the north and a lot of solar in Spain and North Africa. And those numbers add up to 100%, not 80%, because people are also planning that in the building sector and in the transportation sector, we have to be going for 100% decarbonization, because we're going to use all of the carbon that we can afford to put into the atmosphere is going to be coming from agriculture and from certain industries, and we have the ability. And the lowest cost way to go is for the building and the transportation sector, so we should shoot for 100% there. So back to system benefit charges. There are a lot of different policies and a lot of different funding that can lead us toward that goal. It's important to recognize that, however, in this country, it is utility ratepayer funded efficiency which has been the biggest contributor to making these kinds of reductions in the building sector. This is a chart from the Consortium for Energy Efficiency, saying that in the U.S. last year, these utility ratepayer funded efficiency programs totaled around $5.3 billion, which is a pretty big contribution. But it's actually, in most of these programs, if you look across the board, typically it is that public investment that is leveraging a lot of private investment. We need to be pushing that even further through the kind of loan programs that were talked about earlier and very aggressive financing. But even today, it comes out about 1/3, 2/3. That is grants, incentives, and technical assistance at the order of $5 billion are likely inducing building owner investment on the order of $10 billion. Again, a big number, but if I go back to the goals, regrettably, we need to be doing at least twice that much if we're going to hit 2050 in the building sector. There's a lot of variation by state when we look at these utility ratepayer funded programs. You see Vermont there on the top on a per capita basis in 2009 around $50 per capita. You also see some that are, well, in fact, all the states aren't even on the chart because some of them are 0. And our mean per capita is only around 12. Now, I guess the other thing to be clear about here, one of the beauties of this is put forward based on a legislative and regulatory policy framework. It's not coming from carbon, it's not coming from social policy, environmental policy, it's basically just the pure economics. From a utility perspective, our chart there from our last year's annual report, the investments we made of ratepayer funds bought energy services for Vermonters at 2.9 cents per kilowatt hour. And every kilowatt hour that we saved, if utilities had gone out and bought comparable supply at the margin, because the kilowatt hour you save is the last one they had to go out and buy. So it's the most expensive. And if they had bought, say, a kilowatt hour worth of savings for the next 20 years as comparable to an efficiency measure, at our current avoided cost, that's 14 cents per kilowatt hour. One can look at this and say efficiency is a really great deal. I also look at this and say, oh my God, we're under-investing way. People are paying a whole lot more for supply because we aren't doing enough efficiency. So again, you can see where we could be doing 2 or 3 times as much and it's still cheaper than supply. Or as many people have pointed out, as a carbon strategy, it has negative cost. It costs less than business as usual. So just real quick, a little bit about how this is played out in Vermont. Our energy efficiency utility was initiated with system benefit charges. Every retail consumer in Vermont pays a volumetric charge on their electric bill. We've certainly added in some other funds in terms of carbon revenues, our participation in the regional forward capacity market, but primarily founded on the notion of the system benefit charge. All of the utilities, over 20 of them, collect this charge and it goes into an efficiency fund. Our regulator has appointed an entity. The organization happens to be a nonprofit that I co-founded and directed to fulfill the utilities' least cost efficiency procurement requirements. The utilities in the 90s had the responsibility, they were required to do this. Vermont decided we could do better to have a single program statewide and to have an entity that was completely mission aligned with this purpose. Establish this idea of an efficiency utility. But this is not seen as, this is part of utility system cost. It's paid just like all other utility costs. So it's not a, it's not a tax. It is a cost of utility service. And the way that we've established this in Vermont with the efficiency utility, it's a competitively selected entity that delivers this on a performance-based basis. So for instance, in the current 3-year period, we need to deliver a certain number of megawatt hours, a certain number of peak megawatts, and a slew of other performance indicators for a fixed price. The result being that in doing this and this is both history and our projected numbers going forward, the top of the green there is the average 1.5% load growth that Vermont has as underlying. Interestingly, 1.5% is almost exactly what EIA says the whole country is doing on electricity. And the green is our increasing savings. And since 2007, Vermont became the first state to, solely through energy efficiency, turn that load growth curve negative and maintain that now for several years. So couldn't help but put in a little quote there from Dr. Chu, and thank you.
Great. Thank you, Blair. Great. Okay. Our final speaker on this panel is Paul Savage, the CEO of Nextech Power System. And he's been a founding governing member of the Emerge Alliance Corporation, currently a member of the Clinton Global Initiative, and also a member of the board of directors of Windrock International, a really great group that does a lot of work in many, many countries and brings the standard of living up for many people. So, Paul, it's all yours.
Thank you. And let me apologize in advance for not getting to everything I wanted to tell you today. There we are. Like last year, I changed the whole idea of what I wanted to say today because of what happened the day before. And that turned into a short paper that turned into a long paper in the pre-publication that we just saw today, or I just saw today. So thank you, REEL and REEEP and all you acronyms for giving me that opportunity to flesh out an idea. And if you become interested in the idea behind what I'll be talking about here in standards, please refer to that article. It's called DC Microgrids, Benefits and Barriers. And Brian, if you give me a 2-minute warning,
I'll give you a 2-minute warning.
So the idea of a standard, the title Leslie gave me, standards, they're killing, aren't they? It's, you don't know whether it's a flag, a banner, or a book like a phone book in a beige jacket that you want to avoid. I'm an advocate for DC power standards, and I mean that in the flag version, as in the thing you hoist on the battlefield to rally troops behind you. There are, for my purposes, 3 basic kinds of standards: electrical, mechanical, and control standards. These are what are going into the smart grid, as it's been described in the Energy Act of 2007. Interestingly, electrical and mechanical have been the domain of OSHA, the Federal Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Control, not so much, although it's coming to be. I am fresh from the IEEE Transmission and Distribution Conference down in New Orleans, which is what made me decide to change what I wanted to say, because it's so dominated by Cisco, you can't believe it. In fact, between when we decided who was going to be in our panel about transmission and distribution and when it was delivered, Cisco had hired 40% of the panelists. I think not on purpose exactly. But it does show you how things are changing, and it's happening very quickly. If you think of quadrants, this is a little bit meant to confuse. Language can equally confuse or clarify for you. So let's go through public, private, and involuntary. No one, when Microsoft got into the software business, they did not go to the government to help them promulgate the standard. They just did it. Unlike electrical standards, which the government did step in the 20s and 30s to help organize the then nascent electricity business for the good of the country and the interoperability of those systems. Couldn't resist that. CDOS run, DOS run. That was kind of a backwards effort by the scientific community that was behind the original operating systems that got us to where we are today. The National Electric Code, where did it come from? Surprisingly, it's over 100 years old, and almost nobody knows, and I know this because I know almost nobody, that the National Electric Code was created by, indirectly really, a bunch of insurance companies. They were having their lunch eaten by all these early electrical systems that were burning things down at an alarming rate. And so they created the National Fire Protection Association. That is a nonprofit established by insurance companies who were losing too much money to fire. So there's a terrific model back in our history for why you'd create codes in the first instance. And it had to do with risk. And I think that the kinds of codes that I'm an advocate for these days, in addition to my day job, are exactly the same kind of thing, except instead of fire risk, it's really environmental risk, the risk of not capturing the efficiencies that you could code today as an amazing phalanx of sections and people that are in turn interpreted by an amazing collection of state and local building inspectors and other authorities having jurisdiction. And then, of course, Chicago, which is different from all of those other things. So if you look at today's theater, what do we have? You have absolute confusion, I would say, although a lot of people wouldn't admit it, especially chairs of codes committees. They see no confusion at all, when in fact there's a great deal of it. And there's good examples of this because people are using the same words to describe different concepts, and they're using the same concepts with different words. I see it all the time. There's so much crosstalk in what's happening between the stationary and the mobile environment. The National Fire Protection Association, which is the owner of the code, are now working with the Society of Automotive Engineers because there needs to be this interaction between mobile and stationary power systems. You can imagine what those conversations are like. There is zero parts commonality today between the stationary and the mobile power systems. None. Absolutely none. And so it's very interesting to see them come together in the dark and try to figure out what's happening. Cisco, I mentioned, infrastructure mismatches. If you looked at a lot of the efforts that are implicit in the grid, the smart grid effort, that's from the Energy Independence and Security Act, of 2007. If you look at the goals of the smart grid, they rely a lot on IT and communications leverage. It's just that the IT and communications network doesn't have the 30, 40, 50-year design life that most of the major elements in the utility have. So you've got all these semiconductor wingnuts trying to come up with ways to harden all their systems so that they look more like a transformer, and that's great because they need to. And so that's what's happening. I'm guessing I'm close to 2 minutes. Am I right?
On the nose. It just
Okay.
turned.
So now I will, I've told you I was an advocate, now I will advocate. We started with 5 other companies about 18 months ago, something called the eMerge Alliance, to promote DC power standards as a way to promote greater efficiency for all appliances, especially electronic ones, but also to improve the efficiency of on-site distributed power and the integration of storage, which is also DC. Renewables like solar PV and small wind turbines and batteries are all DC devices, just like electronics. And so the logic goes, if you create these networks of DC power in buildings, you can improve the efficiency of the whole lot. Well, it's been tremendously successful so far. We've got over 60 companies, including the Lawrence Berkeley Labs and a couple of big utilities, that are excited about adopting DC power standards as a way to promote efficiency goals and to obtain their smart grid objectives. That's a picture of the one of our systems. We're actually delivering low voltage DC power through the metal grid of the ceiling there. That's an Armstrong product. Armstrong makes over 1 billion square feet a year of suspended ceiling systems. That's right, over 1 billion square feet a year of suspended ceiling systems. And now they have a way of distributing on that conductor you see in the picture, low voltage DC power. That's class 2 power below the shock hazard, which will also advance safety because the #1 killer of electricians is working on a hot lighting system. The U.S. Green Building Council cares. That's their intergalactic conference room in Washington, D.C. That's where they have meetings with other galaxies, U.S. Green Building Council. The Loud Group, that's another installation. I just wanted to show a few pictures, lest you feel it was only my idea. The Los Angeles County Community College District, the community college system in California is the largest customer of solar in California. That's probably not going to be true this year anymore, but it has been true for 3 or 4 years. SoCal Edison, my pals there, that's one of the 2 utilities who are involved, and they're evaluating a couple of systems as ways of reaching their goals for rooftop solar. Of course, what I'm talking about doesn't have any impact on solar fields, but the extent to which you're interested in land use issues ought to make you favor rooftop solar anyway. And integrating it at higher efficiencies ought to be your primary goal. So if you go to the emergealliance.org homepage, you can see who the other folks are in the effort, and it's extraordinary, really. You have building materials manufacturers, you've got electrical goods manufacturers, then you have Steelcase that makes desks, and then you have SoCal Edison, you've got other kinds of controls organizations. So have a look at it, and you can find out more there. And so my idea of a standard is exactly the battlefield example, which I think, interestingly, depends on the staff at the end to raise itself up above the battlefield, doesn't it? So Rachel, that's for you. That's right. The standard depends on the staff. So thank you. That's
Good, thank you, Paul. That's great. All right, so do we have time for okay, how about 2 or 3 questions? We're only going to go 5 minutes here. And I think you heard some interesting topics. Yeah.
Okay, Bob Block of Green Cities, Green Villages. I've got a question for Paul Savage about the DC. There are 2 questions I have about it. One is the advantage of DC relative to AC and vice versa for long distance transmission. And the second, you've got a lot of appliances and devices that are AC. You know, they're already in existence and they cost less because they're mass produced. There's a problem there. How do we deal with those 2 problems?
on the transmission side of things, not my bag, but I would tell you that between service territories, there's always a DC link so that when you bring up a dead grid, you don't have to get synced with the grid next to you. And there is actually more long-distance DC transmission than you would imagine, but it really has nothing to do with what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is really at the edges of the grid. It's a way of giving the grid headroom and advancing these smart grid goals in a more robust way, more cheaply, and with greater efficiency. On the what to do about the installed base, our first targets are commercial and industrial loads like the ceiling, where things are hardwired, or you think of them as hardwired, not plug loads. But this is the entire concept behind the eMERGE Alliance, is to promote a standard, because if there were one, then you would make redundant, billions and billions and billions of power supplies. So it's a trivial undertaking for Dell, to pick a name, to make their laptop work on 24 volts DC, which is that's the first standard we've promulgated for electrical devices in the occupied space. So the long-term goal is to have people make things to operate on 24 volts, which means you can avoid the lossy conversion at the device and take advantage of a higher efficiency conversion at greater power levels in the building.
Okay. Another question in the back.
There might be a unifying issue here. Back in the early 30s, there was a group called Technocracy that were promoting ERGs to replace the gold standard as currency. I believe in the early 70s, Mark Hatfield introduced a similar principle. Could you, perhaps all of you, reflect on currency-based currency that would not only work at the utility levels, Reggies of the world, but also at the consumer-based level?
Are you talking about paying for things with electricity credits, or I'm not familiar with them?
Okay, well, if we're talking about energy as a means of transactional currency. You've had gold-based currencies. You have currencies backed by other, commoditized manifestations. What about ones that are backed by kilowatts?
You mean instead of a hard asset, you want a service to back your currency? Or do you want the power plant to back your currency?
No, I mean, we're reducing, for example, in the case of the REC, to what, 1,352 BTUs? Is that the number up there?
3415 or so, 32.
Something of that nature. But the point is that, at this juncture, we, even at the nano level, are able to gauge what energies are generated. We can put mechanisms on people's needs, for example, the principle being that if you now have a currency that is energy-based, you can begin to get the consumer market to start having transactional interactions using that as a basis. Thereby, in effect, you're monetizing all these various levels of service, not just at the levels that we're seeing it now with carbon credits and things of that caliber, but all the way down to the consumer level.
So you don't mean money, you mean the market?
Well, we're getting into maybe semantics here. I probably do mean it would be a version of money. Yes, it would be a currency.
Well, one of the things that I think brought Cisco, to go back to the example, into the market is this concept of having trillions of transactions going on between devices and their sources. There's a whole lot of intelligence that will go into that, and the awareness of the appliances will create these transactions, and you have lots of inputs that will go into it: time of day, peak pricing, it'll be emissions based on the fuels going in. So you have this huge database of inputs, variables that will work that market, and a requirement of that is that you have all the loads be sufficiently aware as to be able to be one side of a transaction. So in that sense, I think it's coming like a freight train.
I would just say, in terms of the challenge of monetizing residential energy efficiency, you've got the issue of measurement and verification, right? So how do you truly know that what a homeowner is taking is actually leading to reductions? So you aren't truly creating a commodity, so to speak. Maybe with the CFLs, you can show incandescence before and after. It's pretty clear. But when you start doing other things like insulation and other measures, it's hard to really truly understand what reductions you're leading to with measurement and verification that we use. So trying to get to that transaction is harder. On the renewable side, it's pretty clear. You just meter it, and here's the production, issue credits. It's pretty clear on renewables efficiency. It's tougher to get to that commodity transaction.
All right, well, we're gonna cut this off now because we do have to go to break. I just want to say I think that in both panels this morning, I think we've really had some good discussions about a number of best practices, or maybe in deference to Keith Welks, at least pretty good practices. I think they're excellent practices. I think you're going to hear more this afternoon. And again, these are really critical to getting a market transformed out there and getting efficiency accelerated into that market. So again, thank you all very much. How about a last round of applause for our panel?